God is risen, I believe, from our prison we're relieved. He's our Savior, dear and true, life eternal for me and you.
Anyway, appreciate everyone coming today. We have a good speaker with a good program. I'll go ahead and introduce Reverend George McGavern. He's at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd here in Tomball. He's a member of the Chaplain Fellowship, serving Tomball Regional Medical Center, and the Pastors Alliance. That's great if you can get that going. He and his wife and 4 daughters live in the Magnolia area off of Hardin Store Road. He graduated from the University of South Florida with a degree in mechanical engineering, with nearly 20 years experience in the oil and gas industry. His 2 friends started a business in the Woodlands, and which continues to thrive today. And then after 10 years of the business, he was called to ministry to the Episcopal Church. He attended seminary at Southwest in Austin and was ordained in 2013. Before coming to Tomball, he served as assistant priest at Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Magnolia. Today, he'll be telling us a story as a follower of Jesus Christ. And this is about across the board. It doesn't make any difference. Quite honestly, no disrespect if you have a collar or not. It's all the same for all of us. Be assured of that. And I wanted to, the other good thing about is he's an aviator, and I love that. I love Christ. He loves Christ. And the thing about George that stuck out with me is that the first time I met him at his church, went in there to get them to help us with the Veterans Luncheon that we had last year, and we'll have again this year, was he was just as open as you can be. He wasn't withholding anything. His welcoming friendship was just there. It wasn't, well, what are you doing here? What do you want? And, he was just very openly in friendship. And as Christians, that's the other thing we need to do, right? So I need to work on that a lot. But all in all, we just are glad you're here today, and I'd like for you to come up and give us your story.
I was born in 1970, but I was born in the 21st century. It just took 30 years for it to catch up to me, I can tell you that. I don't know if you all remember the last time I was here. I think it was at the Veterans presentation, and the day before, I was supposed to come and give the invocation, and the day before, actually maybe that morning, Patrick called me and says, "Hey, can you lead us in singing the national anthem?" I said, well, I guess I can. So no surprises like that today. It is an honor and a privilege for me to be here to get to tell you some of my story as a follower of Jesus, and my perspective on when following Jesus intersects with business. As Patrick said, I'm the rector of Good Shepherd Church in Tomball. And if you don't know where that is, that's because we're nicely hidden in the trees about a quarter mile off of Main Street. We're directly across the street from Concordia High School. And if you don't know what a rector is, that is okay also, because we have all kinds of crazy words for stuff in the Episcopal Church. For example, this is not a cup or a goblet, it is a chalice. Not a plate, but a paten. Not a napkin, but a purificator. A thurible, an ambo. We would call this a verge. Really, that's what we would call that. And this is a missile. And maybe we call it that so if you fall asleep, this is what gets thrown at you. You name it, we'll call it something else. Or maybe more accurately, you name it, and we'll call it that forever, for 1,000 years. And so this is not a senior pastor. This is a rector that you see here before you. And we have an expression in the Episcopal Church that is used to differentiate the kinds of people that are there. If you were born to Episcopalian parents, and you were an Episcopalian your entire life, we would call you a cradle Episcopalian. And if you went into Good Shepherd Church, or really most Episcopal churches throughout the country, on any given Sunday, you would find that maybe fewer than 50% of the people in that church are cradle Episcopalians. The rest of us, me included, got there one way or another. We all have different stories as to the variety of ways in which we were led to the Episcopal Church. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. A lot of people ask me, how did you find yourself going from business and engineering and oil and gas to the ministry? And that's actually a fairly long story, but I'm delighted to be able to share some of that story with you here today. I did not grow up in Texas. My dad served our country as an officer in the U.S. Air Force for 22 years. I was born in California. I kind of grew up all over the place. He retired when I was 13 years old to my parents' hometown of Zephyrhills, Florida, near Tampa Bay. This is where I met my wife, and after I graduated from the University of South Florida in Tampa with a degree in mechanical engineering, we were married and we moved out here to Houston, where I found work. That was 1993. And I have now lived in Texas considerably longer than I have lived anywhere else in my life, by a lot. I do have one sister. She's a veterinarian in Florida. She got her doctorate of veterinary medicine from the University of Florida in Gainesville. She has a practice there in Zephyrhills, and she is near my parents. My wife Missy and I have been married for 25 years. We have 4 daughters that we're all very proud of. They all pretty much look the same, except for my youngest. This picture is 2 years old. She is now taller than everybody but me in that picture and looks completely different. I was looking at it this morning and thought, man, I need to get a more recent photo. So as I said, I am not a cradle Episcopalian. I was raised in the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church. If you do not know what the CMA Church is, or if you've not heard of that, it's a loosely organized federation of churches around a common goal to support missionary work overseas. You may have heard of or read A.W. Tozer. He's a preeminent scholar and theologian of the CMA. If you haven't heard of him or read him, I highly recommend him. And it's important for you to know that my family has deep roots in the CMA. My grandparents on my mother's side were missionaries overseas with the CMA, mostly in the Far East, some in South America and some in Europe. Both of my grandfathers literally built the church that you see there. That is the Alliance Church in Zephyrhills, and my grandfather on my father's side pastored that for probably about 20 years. I have family to this day, aunts and uncles, cousins and cousins' children, who are missionaries overseas in Africa, Taiwan, and other places. And my parents are both graduates of Nyack College in Nyack, New York. This is the CMA undergraduate school and seminary, and they were training to be overseas missionaries as well when my dad was drafted in 1960. So he was drafted, but he subsequently volunteered for the Air Force. And to my memory, we always managed to find a CMA church wherever he was stationed, and that's where we went to church. His last tour was in Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. This was when I was about 10 years old, and instead of going to a base church there, we drove quite a distance to attend a mission church there run by CMA missionaries Doris and Winnie Jacobson. It's not a very good picture of them, but you can see them there on the bottom. And through that, we got hooked into the work that World Relief was doing in the Philippines with Vietnamese refugees. You know, in the early 1980s, there was still quite an influx of refugees making a perilous journey by boat from Vietnam to the Philippines. And it was there in a refugee camp in Bataan that I was baptized by missionary Floyd Gibbs in the Morong River, along with dozens of new converts to Christianity from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Philippines in particular were really important in my life. I didn't know it at the time, and I probably didn't know it for the first half of my adulthood, but I do now. I do now. After my dad retired, like I said, we settled back in my parents' hometown of Zephyr Hills, and we attended the very church that I showed you earlier that my grandfathers had built. But about the time I got to college, the spiritual life of that church was at an all-time low. And I found myself making every excuse I could not to go. Like if I had a test coming up in a couple of weeks, even though I'm not going to study until the night before, and everybody knew that, I wouldn't go. And honestly, all four of us were doing that. And one day, someone invited my parents to come to church with her at St. Mary's Episcopal Church up in Dade City, Florida, and they jumped at it. And they dragged me along with them. And I have to say, we fell in love with it right away. It was a little scary at first. I remember that first Sunday, I thought to myself, what are the odds that we have shown up at this church on a week that they're actually having communion? In the CMA, we took communion once a quarter, but in the Episcopal Church, it's every Sunday. And the whole idea of going up to the altar and doing this in front of everybody and drinking out of a common cup was quite uncomfortable. I just remember in the back of the car the next Sunday thinking, well, at least we're not going to be doing that again. Boy, was I surprised. But something happened to me in this switch. Because in the Episcopal Church, for the first time in my life, I was actively worshiping. I, up to this point, had always been a passive participant in worship services. We may sing some hymns, and perhaps the pastor would call on somebody in the congregation to pray, which was pretty common. But all in all, most of us were passive participants in the service. Corporate worship was completely new to me. And all of a sudden, I found myself standing, kneeling, sitting, and saying things out loud that I wasn't sure I believed. And this was at a time, of course, like I said, when I was in college. And I have to tell you, Christianity was under attack in the university, and I'm sure that it still is today. I had more than one professor who made it their mission to discredit Christianity. And of all the world religions, this was the one that got the most negative attention. My mind was expanding. I was learning new and amazing things. I was beginning to think in new and critical ways. And all of a sudden, this house of cards that was my faith was on shaky ground, and somebody was pulling it out one card at a time. And my newfound experience in the Episcopal Church was waking me up to question all of it. And this went on for perhaps a year or two, and I really struggled. But early on, in maybe late high school or early on in my college career, I met two really smart scientists who were knee-deep in the creationist movement that sprung up in the 60s. Many of you know, are familiar with that and know what I'm talking about. These were smart men who were prominent in their fields of science, and I got to meet them personally and talk to them. One was A.E. Wilder Smith, a British scientist who was at the time the world's foremost expert in the science of pharmacology, that is, the science of how drugs interact with the cells. And the other was a former fellow at Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley, a microbiologist by the name of Dr. Duane Gish. And I also, my college physics professor was a Christian, and he didn't preach at us, but he did talk openly about his faith and about Christianity, and he was the one kind of dissenting voice I heard from my professors. All of these, and none of these men were, just kind of like fanatics that would believe anything. These were highly intelligent, highly educated, critically thinking men who found Christianity credible. And this is also when I discovered C.S. Lewis, who was an Anglican, someone from this new tradition that I was a part of, who spoke or wrote openly about doubt and his own struggles with atheism. this gave me kind of a foothold, something to hang on to during this time. And eventually the house of cards did collapse. But when I kind of shuffled it all back together again, I found myself on much firmer ground. And I emerged with a new understanding and a new sense of how important doubt is to faith, how important doubt and faith are to one another. You know, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty, right? The opposite of faith is certainty. Paul says we hope for that which we haven't seen. If we could see it, we wouldn't have hope, we would have certainty. And doubt is, I discovered, an intrinsic part of faith. Doubt is what gives faith the vulnerability it needs to have the power to move mountains. And it was soon after this experience that I began sensing a calling into ordained ministry. I don't think it was before I graduated because I was pretty focused on becoming an engineer, but it was pretty quickly after that. And as I got more formed in this Anglican tradition, I gained a stronger and stronger sense that God was calling me to ministry. Over the ensuing years, that call would wax or wane. Oh, look at me, I'm not advancing the slides. That call would wax or wane, but overall it was gaining ground. Well, in 2000, I and a couple of friends started an engineering consulting business, Tejas Research and Engineering, still in business here in the Woodlands. One of my friends had learned of an opportunity, an emerging opportunity to develop a product line for a fast-growing products and services company where we had some particular expertise to offer. And I thought at the time, because we put this thing together and doggone, they bought our story and we were all of a sudden we're in business. And I thought at the time, what we are doing is so niche and so specialized that we're going to do this over 3 years and that will be the end of it. I'll make maybe a little bit of money and this will be my opportunity to exit out of oil and gas and go to seminary. And lo and behold, that did not happen. We managed to land other long-term contracts. We bought a product line from Schlumberger that we began manufacturing. We developed a high-tech, high-temperature, high-pressure testing laboratory. And all of a sudden, with this crazy idea that was hatched in somebody's garage, literally, had turned into a multi-million-dollar business with over 30 employees and doing all of this great stuff. And during this time, my awareness of that call waned because I was just working so much to get this venture off the ground. Well, that was the year 2000. One day in the early fall of 2006, I'll never forget this, I was going into town to meet with the Reverend Nick Dyke. He was a relatively new interim rector there at Trinity, where my wife and I had been parishioners for that whole time since '93. This is in Midtown Houston, just south of downtown. And I didn't know Nick all that well because he had only been there for a few months, but I had some church business I needed to discuss with him and a few others. And he came downstairs from his office, he introduced himself, he asked me what I did for a living. I told him about Tejas, and then without me even asking or pretending to be interested, he said, you know, I owned a construction company when I was called into ministry. I just gave that to my brother, and that was 30 years ago, and no regrets. I've never looked back. All of a sudden, this call that had kind of gone into the background came rushing forward in an amazing way. I was consumed by it. From the moment I woke up in the morning to the moment I went to bed, it consumed my thoughts. And I realized I'm not going to be allowed to wait until it's convenient for me to answer this call. I had to make a decision, yes or no, at a time when it was very inconvenient. And so on April 9th, 2007, I was suddenly overwhelmed by the sense of this call. I couldn't take the pressure any longer. And I yielded to what I'd been resisting for so long. And I sought out Father Nick, who by this time was serving as an interim someplace else. and I began the process of discerning this call into ministry. In the Episcopal Church, you can't just go and say, hey, I'd like to be a preacher and go to seminary. They have a rather arduous process of discernment that you have to go through. And the complication of me owning a business, that process was about 3 years for me. It was a little over 3 years. And I'll say, when I came to the Episcopal Church, I had a pretty one-dimensional understanding of Jesus and salvation. Mostly because I was young, but also because of just my limited exposure to the broader Christian tradition. Compared to my faith of origin, what I experienced in the Episcopal Church was much more of a cosmic view of salvation. Instead of language of Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, what I heard in the liturgy, what I heard from the pulpit, what I heard in the readings from the Bible that we got in church was that all of creation was on tiptoe in eager anticipation of being made new. And it released from its bondage to decay. I began to grasp the idea of mystery. This idea that God and what God does cannot be fully grasped or fully understood. Whereas before I thought I had a complete understanding of baptism as a profession of faith, as communion as a memorial of Christ's sacrifice, and salvation as something that's happening by belief on my part, I began to contemplate the mystery of the work of the Holy Spirit in baptism. I began to contemplate communion as communion with the whole company of saints, as somehow participation in Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension, making all the creation new. And that Jesus did not come here just to die for my sins by his death on a cross, but he came to make the whole creation new by his life and resurrection. I was in the process of deconstructing my faith. And when I put it back together, it was now kind of a two-dimensional faith, and I had a two-dimensional Jesus. And over those years, I developed a pretty high Anglo-Catholic piety. Like, I looked nothing like what I looked like in the CMA. I was moving towards mystery, and I was running as fast as I could from Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. And by the time I entered seminary, in 2010, I had been an Episcopalian for 20 years, substantially all of my adult life. And if you had asked me at the time, I would have told you that I am not evangelical, for whatever that word may mean for you. But you know, seminary it's a process of formation. It's not so much that you don't get educated in seminary about what the church teaches on this doctrine or that doctrine, or you don't get trained on how to run church meetings or how to shepherd your flock. Seminary is really a lot more about becoming more self-aware, getting your own issues up to the surface and dealing with them, than it is gaining external knowledge. And as I began to interact with my classmates in this crucible of the academic environment, I found out that I was a lot more evangelical than I had given myself credit for. I began to reclaim the gift that was my upbringing in the CMA, and I heard myself saying things that sounded a lot more like A.W. Tozer than it did Jeremy Taylor or Richard Hooker or any of the other preeminent Anglican divines. Many of my classmates who were either cradle Episcopalians or who came from other non-evangelical traditions, they lacked the missionary experience and the evangelical language that I had. And I found myself drawing on that language and experience more and more in our conversations. There is something about Jesus that was good news to those people with whom I was baptized in the Morong River. There is something about Jesus that was good news to these people with whom I went to church in this mission church in the Philippines. And there is a growing number of people in our community and our country who have no connection whatsoever to Christianity or to church and who are not going to come visit our churches, no matter how awesome we're doing the things that we do in there, because it's just not part of their lives. Our mission is to meet people where they are, where they gather, where they conduct their business, to share with them Jesus by what we do, by what we say, by the love that we have for them, and by the love that we have for us, right? Jesus said, they will know you are my disciples by the love that you have for one another. So we got to stop fighting about all the stupid stuff we fight about. There is something about Jesus that is good news to the people who are living in our backyard. Seminary was, again, an experience for me very much of dismantling my faith. My understanding and beliefs about Jesus, God and Trinity, salvation and the sacraments, all of it. It was very much a process of taking that all apart and putting it back together again. This time in 3D. I got a 3D Jesus now. And whereas I had left one dimension of my faith behind, when I reclaimed it and honored it, I found myself to be much more complete. Much more complete. And I honestly cannot wait to have it dismantled again and put back in who knows what kind of dimensions we could even imagine. So that's a little bit about me. I've got more I want to say, but we're running short on time, so I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. Now that you know me a little bit better, I would like to share with you my perspective on owning a business and being a Christian. And I want to do that through an illustration of a story of an experience I've had. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to attend a Project Curate conference in downtown Houston entitled Reimagining Incarceration and Reentry. And the conference brought together scholastics and criminal justice professionals and state officials and social workers, faith leaders, and community organizers to explore ways to reduce recidivism among a population of people who find themselves in and out of jail their whole lives. In many ways, and you know this, our criminal justice system is broken, at least in the sense that it seems to result in high recidivism rates. There was a famous study by the Department of Justice in 2005. They studied over 400,000 inmates in prison and over the periods of their release, and what they found was within 3 years, 2/3 of that population were rearrested after their release. They found that after 5 years, 75% were rearrested. So that's 300,000 out of 400,000. And of those, half, about 150,000, were rearrested within the first year. The system is really stacked against the offender. And I'll give you an example. We had a man in our church who was arrested up here in Tomball and was in jail at the Baker Street County, Harris County Jail downtown. So we take somebody from up here and we house them way down here where it's hard for the people who support them to come and visit. And there's all kinds of barriers, like, and it's not just the distance, parking was expensive. Every time he called us, it cost us $18 to receive the collect call, right? $3 for the collect call and $15 for the company that makes it possible. Can you imagine how hard that is on people who do not have the means to stay in touch with their loved ones? He was in jail for 13 months. He wasn't even arraigned for over 9 months. And after 13 months, he finally had his day in court. The charges were reduced from a felony down to criminal mischief. Right or wrong, he pled guilty to those charges. And of course, the amount of time that he had served in jail already was way beyond the maximum sentence for that offense, so he was released, or processed for release. And by the time they got him processed for release, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and they turned him out on the streets of downtown. And I will tell you, there is nobody good waiting to greet you downtown at 4 o'clock in the morning when you get let out of jail. Thankfully, I found him at 7 in the morning. And, you know, while he was in jail, he was on a disability with Social Security. You can't collect Social Security while you're in jail, even though your expenses continue, right? The money stops, and so he lost his trailer home and everything that was in it. And it took 7 months after his release to get the Social Security turned back on. What do you think the odds are of somebody who has entered into some crime, even a minor crime, who comes out and finds himself like this, that they'll return to a life of crime? Or imagine somebody in prison, right? I have a friend of mine in Kingwood. He lives in Kingwood. His son was arrested in Houston, convicted, and he was incarcerated in the prison in Hondo of all places, far from where the people who love and support him could go and visit. And oftentimes, when you get released from prison, you're put on a bus and sent right back to the very place you got in trouble to begin with. So we came together to share our ideas on how to improve this. And overall, it was a very good conference. The keynote speakers were really interesting. They were wonderful, actually. But of course, one of the big factors in recidivism is the ability to find employment with a criminal record. Talk to an ex-con about that difficulty. It's harder for them than it is for the hardcore unemployed. Even if they have the desired skills to offer perhaps something they learned in prison. And this was talked about extensively at the conference, but I heard something there that really bothered me. While the keynote speakers didn't do this, on more than one occasion in the table talk and in the workshops, some well-meaning social activist demonized business and business owners for their role in this problem. Some social activists stood here and said, "You people over there, it's your fault. Why we have this. What you should do is just hire ex-convicts and everything will be good." And I even heard the argument that when you hire an ex-con, you will engender loyalty and gratitude. And while I agree that that is possible, I have to say from my experience in business, hiring less than hireable people is bad for business, categorically. At Tejas, we had a practice, not a policy, but a practice of hiring less than hireable people. Being illiterate, a recovering addict, having a criminal record, a pregnant single mother-to-be, these were not automatically exclusions for hiring or being considered for employment. And we did have one employee who was just absolutely stellar. He was the hardest working guy I have ever met, and he was just very grateful that we gave him a chance when nobody else would. But like I said, overall, this was bad for business. When you hire a recovering addict, and one who's new in recovery, not somebody who's been sober for 30 years, but somebody who's been sober maybe for a year, they're going to relapse. Relapse is part of recovery. They're not going to show up to work one day. We had guys not show up to work. We were stolen from. We had an accident. Thankfully, nobody was seriously hurt, but we did the drug screening you do after accidents, and he was high on cocaine. And that's the kind of thing that can destroy your business, right? This is bad for business. And it's easy to demonize the business owners like these folks were doing and the executives of bigger companies. But the truth is, as an owner and an executive, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your corporation and to your employees and to their families and to their well-being. And that is what motivates you. It's not profit that motivates us to stay healthy. It is concern for those who work for us and the well-being of the business. And this has to be recognized before we start asking businesses to become part of the solution of the problem of recidivism. We have to be able to have a conversation, a loving, non-judgmental conversation, if we're going to solve this. At Tejas, having a practice of hiring from marginalized groups came more from a sense of doing the right thing than it did from trying to find the best employees. And sometimes doing the right thing means you need to put your welfare, your business's welfare, at risk to do it. But honestly, at the end of the day, doing good is good for business. Doing good matters to good business. And this is where I think the church can really make a difference. With our social structure and our beliefs, we are uniquely positioned to make an impact on challenges like this and to change the world. So take just a moment, and I'm not going to take as much moment as I was hoping, but take just a moment to think about what makes a business uniquely a Christian business, or you as a Christian uniquely Christian. Whenever I see a business with a fish or a cross on the sign or openly advertising they are Christian run, I often think what is meant to be conveyed is we try our best to be honest and trustworthy and ethical and fair in our business practices in a manner that's consistent with our faith in Jesus. But it conveys something much more than this, because honesty and trustworthiness is hardly unique to Christianity. I know many a staunch atheist who run their business in a trustworthy manner. What makes us uniquely Christian is that we follow Jesus. We follow Jesus. And so what did Jesus say about being his follower? What did Jesus say about being his follower? He said, if anyone want to become my follower, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who lose their life, those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose it for my sake will save it. What does it profit you to gain the whole world? Forfeit yourself. We follow a Lord who asks us daily to pour out ourselves in the way that he poured himself out. And I think that this is so important. Whenever you want to try to instill a Christian ethic or virtue in your business practice, this is what it looks like. Honesty and fairness, these are just sound business principles. Self-sacrifice, self-giving, taking up our crosses daily, following Jesus. This is uniquely Christian in the way that we do it. We follow a Lord who poured himself out, who asks us to do the same. And oftentimes the goals of the kingdom of God are in opposition to the goals of good business. Following Jesus may very well be bad for business, but it has the power to change the world. So after the conference, I had a long correspondence chain with the keynote speakers, and we talked through how, if we're going to change anything about recidivism, I think it will begin with small business and small business leaders like yourselves, because in the bigger corporation, the lines of accountability are more complex. But then the leaders in the community and faith organizers and so forth have the ability then to, using that as an example, lead and engage in conversation with the larger publicly traded corporations. And I hold this out to you as an example of how following Jesus can manifest in how we run our businesses. There is no problem too big for us to solve when we can pick up our cross and follow Jesus. So I encourage you in your daily vocations and in the way you run business, have conversations with your colleagues. Ask the questions, how can I make a difference by what I am doing? How can you make a difference by what you are doing? I know it's not easy and that it is a voluntary choice. And so for those of you who are doing this already, God bless you in what you are doing. I know it is difficult. God bless you when you hear God's call to something, because it will come in an inconvenient time. And may God bless the thoughts of your hearts and the labors of your hands, that in all things you will produce good fruit for his kingdom. Thank you for your time and attention and for giving me this opportunity. I'm sorry I had to kind of rush through the latter half of that, but I am really privileged to get this chance to share some of my story with you. Thank you. And Patrick, do we have time for one or two questions, if there are any? Well, for me, at that age, it was certainly mere Christianity, and I got into all of his kind of theological treatise books, like The Problem of Pain, The Four Loves, and all of those. Surprised by Joy, I would say if you have not read Surprised by Joy, that is a good one to read. A Grief Observed is maybe a little bit more difficult, but Surprised by Joy is a great one to read. He talks openly about his doubts and his struggles in there. And then I love, the books that are like God in the Dock and The Weight of Glory. These are collections of his sermons and writings and letters. Those were really important to me as well. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? What I try to say about politics is no one is righteous, not one. And that's a better place for us to start to have conversation than, again, it is for me to stand over here and say, you're doing this wrong over there. And so I do, but I'm pretty hard on both sides of the political spectrum. The church has oftentimes done things which have been hurtful. I talk to a lot of people who have experienced kind of hurtful, I don't know what the right word is, pushiness, if you will, from church or from Christians. It's unfortunate that they can't have a little bit of grace in their understanding about that. But if something causes somebody to stumble, that's an okay thing to lay down. If you want to, in your business, express your faith and your identity, I would say feel comfortable doing that. There's no guarantee that that doesn't bring reprisal. There's a wonderful book called Mold Me, Shape Me. It was written by an Episcopal priest who was a plastic surgeon, and he prayed before every surgery, and the anesthesiologist that he worked with hated it. And he walked out of the operating. He told him, if you pray, I'm walking out of the operating room. And he did it anyway. So there are some, but you have to be willing. I would want to do that in a way that hurts the person. And you got to do that in a way that's honoring God and not your own pride. Yeah. I hope that was helpful. Anything else? Okay, because I could keep talking. You know that, Patrick. I see you coming, but I can keep talking. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I think that's off.
That's okay. Thank you again. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for being here and sharing your experiences in life. And to the lady that asked the question, I'd just say the Bible's pretty clear about us denying Christ to others. And, we have to do it in compassion and in love. But and that's what Christ would want us to do. So I think that, I don't know your particular situation, but we should be as bold as we can about Jesus Christ. Dave, come on up. He's going to close in prayer. And I wanted to mention, when you asked about C.S. Lewis, come on up. And it reminded me that the Lanier Theological Library, how many of you know what that is? One, two, just a handful. He's got the first edition of every C.S. Lewis book ever on display. Personal notes, just a fabulous place. And the library is basically about religion and not just Christian religion. They have all kind of references to all kind of faiths. Excellent place to go and have some quiet time or whatever it may be. Next, you've got the flyers for next one's speaker, and we appreciate you coming. And Dave McGavern's going to close us in prayer, and then you'll be excused.
Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, first of all, just want to thank you for allowing us to live in a country where we have the freedom to organize luncheons like this and bring people together, to hear wonderful messages like Rector McGavern has brought us today. I would also just like to ask that you hold your hand of mercy and grace over the Fry family this week as they prepare to say their final goodbyes to Jack. I pray that as we leave this luncheon today, go about our business, that we do it in a way that's pleasing to you. I ask this in your name. Amen.